At my husband's will reading, my daughter looked me dead in the eyes and said I was no longer her mother. She told me to keep that useless old beach house and get out of her life. I sat there frozen. My hands were trembling, but not a single tear fell. All those years of love erased in a sentence. But that so-called worthless house was hiding something. And what happened after changed everything. I sat in the corner chair at the lawyer's office, the same seat I always took when Robert and I had appointments. The air smelled like cold coffee and dusted books. I had a handkerchief folded in my coat pocket just in case, but my hands stayed still. I wasn't expecting anything dramatic. I was just here to listen to my husband's will. I thought it would be quiet, maybe even gentle. Tessa walked in, wearing a navy pantsuit and sunglasses, though we were indoors. She didn't look at me. She sat across the room and pulled out her phone. Her nails clicked across the screen, like nothing about this day mattered. The lawyer, Mr. Hamilton, cleared his throat and began. He spoke of Robert's wishes, his gratitude, his instructions. Then he paused. He looked at me, then her. He said Robert had left the beach house in Depot Bay to me. That was when Tessa finally looked up. She leaned back, crossed her legs, and said calm as anything, "Keep that useless old beach house. I don't see you as my mother anymore." That was it. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The room was already silent. No one blinked. No one stopped her. And I didn't say a word. I just sat there. My fingers curled against the armrest. I felt them digging into the fabric. Not from anger, just to hold myself in place, to not float off, to not disappear completely. I looked at Tessa and realized something I hadn't seen before. Her eyes didn't flinch, not with cruelty, but with certainty. She had rehearsed this. She had waited for this. It wasn't the rejection that hurt the most. It was how ready she was to cut me out. Mr. Hamilton stuttered something about moving on about documents. I didn't hear the rest. I stood nodded once and walked out before he finished reading the remaining terms. The hallway outside felt brighter than it should have, but everything still seemed muted, like the whole building was underwater. I had known Tessa since she was 7. She held my hand the day I married her father. She had called me Mom when she had nightmares. She had written me letters from camp with hearts and flowers. I kept them in a shoebox under my bed. Still do. But none of that mattered today. What mattered was what she had just made perfectly clear. I was no longer her mother. And there was that old beach house. That was mine now. I didn't know what I'd do with it. But something in me, something quiet and buried, started to shift. Maybe you've had a moment like that too, where someone draws a line and dares you to cross it, where someone thinks they've cut you down, but they've only given you ground to stand on. That's what this story is. Not about loss, not even about revenge. It's about the moment I stopped waiting for someone to call me family and started becoming someone whole on my own terms. When Robert and I got married, Tessa was 7. She stood beside him in her little white shoes and a lacy dress her grandmother had picked. She refused to hold my hand during the ceremony, but afterward, when the lights dimmed and the music faded, she fell asleep in my lap at the reception. I remember thinking maybe this was how it started. Not all at once, but gently. Her mother had passed from an aggressive cancer, and Robert had done everything he could to keep the world steady for that girl. When he and I met, he was still deep in grief, but he smiled when he talked about Tessa. He said she was the strongest person he knew. I believed him. For the first few years, I tiptoed. I didn't try to replace anyone. I didn't push. I was just there, present. I packed school lunches, sat through parent-teacher meetings, waited at the edge of soccer games. I braided her hair every morning before school. Sometimes she let me sit on the bed while she read aloud. Her voice small, focused, always careful. On her 9th birthday, she called me Mum in front of her friends. I didn't cry then, but I remember the way my chest tightened like it was holding something too fragile to breathe on. That was the moment I thought we were okay. I thought we were building something real. Years passed. High school came and went. We had quiet years. No big fights, no outbursts, just silence growing between us. At the time, I chalked it up to teenage distance. Every time she rolled her eyes or answered with one-word sentences, I told myself it was normal. But in hindsight, it wasn't just distance. It was detachment. And it was quiet. That's what made it dangerous. By the time she left for college, we had fallen into a rhythm. Holiday visits, birthday cards, the occasional text. She never said anything cruel. She just stopped sharing the parts of herself that mattered. Robert tried to explain it once. He said that maybe Tessa had always held on to the idea that I wasn't her real mother, that maybe she had built a room in her mind where her mother still existed, and I could never step inside that room. I didn't argue. I understood. But I still believed that love, steady, patient love, could soften that space, could earn its way in. So I stayed. Even when things felt one-sided, I stayed. Robert's death made everything sharper, quieter, final. The phone calls from Tessa became shorter if they came at all. She managed the funeral details with crisp efficiency, never asking for input. She gave me the role of silent observer, and I accepted it. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to lose what was left. Now, sitting alone in my kitchen, the weight of that silence felt heavier than ever. It wasn't just grief, it was clarity. I had spent 35 years hoping to become something I never really was in her eyes. And still I loved her. That's the part that's hardest to carry. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised anymore. But I did feel something shift that day. The kind of shift you feel when you've been leaning on a door that was never going to open. And suddenly, you stop knocking. I arrived at the beach house just after dusk. The wind coming off the water was sharp but familiar. The driveway was still uneven, full of stubborn gravel Robert never got around to fixing. I stepped out of the car and stood for a moment staring at the porch light we had installed 27 years ago. It still flickered when the wind blew hard enough. The key stuck in the lock. I had to jiggle it twice before it gave way. The door creaked like it remembered me. Inside, the air was musty with salt and old paper. No one had been here since the fall. Robert was supposed to patch the roof before the winter storms rolled in, but time got away from us. And then it got away from him entirely. The house looked smaller somehow. The walls seemed to lean inward. I turned on the lamps one by one, walking through the living room with slow steps. His armchair was still where he had left it, facing the bay window. There was a book open on the side table. His reading glasses sat on top, crooked. I left them as they were. In the kitchen, the fridge hummed faintly. I opened it and found a bottle of mustard, a jar of olives, and 2 cans of seltzer. I tossed them in the trash, cleaned the shelves, let the cold air settle into the silence. Upstairs, the bedroom was untouched. The bed was made, the pillows fluffed. Robert had always been particular about how the sheets were tucked. I sat down on the edge and ran my fingers across the quilt I had stitched together years ago. It was faded now, the red squares almost pink, but my hands remembered every piece of fabric. Every hour spent at the dining table with the radio playing low in the background. In the guest room, the walls still held the faint outline of Tessa's old posters. We had peeled them down when she turned 20 and insisted the room looked childish. Now it was mostly empty. Just a lamp, a dresser, a mattress wrapped in plastic. The corners smelled like dust and something that hadn't been remembered in a long time. I opened the back door and stepped out onto the porch. The sea was black in the distance. The waves whispered rather than crashed. There were no neighbors in sight. Just the outline of the cliffs and the wind moving through the dunes. This place had been our escape. Whenever city life grew too loud, Robert would say we needed a weekend by the water. He believed the sea could rinse away whatever the world piled on. And sometimes it did. We hosted dinners here, just the three of us. Then later, just the two. I made lemon chicken every Easter. Robert grilled salmon in the summer. Tessa liked to collect shells at low tide. She kept them in jars, labeled them by date. One of those jars was still on the bookshelf. I picked it up. The label had faded, but I remembered the handwriting. July 1997. I didn't realize I was crying until I tasted the salt on my lips. It was the kind of crying that snuck up quietly. No sound, no trembling, just the body releasing something it could no longer carry. I stayed out there until the chill wrapped around my shoulders. Then I went back inside, closed the door, locked it behind me. This house was mine now, not because it was given, but because it was left. And somehow that felt heavier than I expected. The calls stopped, not that there had been many to begin with, but now it was silence, full, thick, deliberate silence. I checked my email one morning and found that I had been removed from the family group thread. No message, no warning, just gone. My access to the shared drive with old photos, birthdays, recipes vanished. The login said invalid. I tried to reset the password, but the recovery address had been changed. I sat at the kitchen table with the laptop open, staring at the blank inbox. There wasn't even spam. That was the strange part. It was like I had been quietly erased, as if someone had gone through every corner of the digital world and scrubbed me out. 2 days later, my neighbor from Portland, Marianne, called. She said she saw Tessa on a real estate live stream. Tessa had been showing off the Mercer townhouse in the Pearl District, walking through the hallways like she owned the place. But that was the house Robert and I lived in during our first years of marriage. The deed was in his name, but the furniture, the art, the shelves of books, that was mine. I checked the property records. It had been listed for sale through a third-party LLC. I recognized the names of the holding company. They had been tied to Robert's late-stage investments. Tessa must have gotten access through probate, or through something I hadn't seen yet. But she was liquidating. One property at a time. I scrolled through the photos of the house. My favorite rug was rolled into the corner. The books were gone. My chair, my one soft blue reading chair, was missing. In its place stood a modern grey couch that looked like it had never been touched. The walls were bare. Even the old mirror in the hallway, the one that Robert found at an antique store, had been replaced with something cold and square and new. I closed the laptop. It wasn't just about the things. It was about being pushed out of a life I had helped build. Quietly. Over decades. And she wasn't finished. A week later, Jolene called. She still worked with a firm that handled estate accounting. She sounded hesitant, but she told me what she had seen. Tessa had submitted documents to the bank listing herself as primary executor and claiming authorization to manage a trust connected to the beach house, the house that was supposed to be mine. I asked Jolene how that could happen. She said it would require some level of signature, some form of consent, something notarized. My stomach sank. I remembered a folder Tessa had handed me after Robert's funeral. She said it was from the probate lawyer. I had been so exhausted, so clouded with grief, I signed whatever she gave me. I trusted her. Now I realized I had signed something that gave her access. Maybe not full ownership, but enough to make trouble. I went to the cabinet where I kept the documents. They were gone. Just a blank space between Robert's medical files and the folder with the title to our old car. I leaned against the wall. The house creaked softly behind me, the kind of sound that felt almost alive. I let the silence stretch, listening to the wind scrape against the windows. This wasn't just about being excluded. This was about being replaced. My name was being lifted piece by piece from the story of my own life, and I knew then I couldn't stay quiet much longer. It was a soft thump under my feet that pulled me out of my thoughts. I had been walking across the living room, heading toward the back porch, when the board near the bookshelf dipped slightly. It wasn't the first time. That spot had always creaked. But this time, something felt off. A hollow sound, like something underneath had shifted. I knelt down and ran my hand across the floor. The wood there was slightly loose, just enough to lift. I wedged the edge with a butter knife from the kitchen. After some wiggling, the board came free, revealing a shallow cavity beneath the floor. Inside was a rusted metal box covered in dust and a thin layer of cobwebs. I hesitated for a moment, then lifted it out. It was heavier than I expected. The latch stuck, but after a few tries it opened. The first thing I saw was a folded envelope. My name was written on the front in Robert's handwriting. Not Evie, not Mrs. Mercer, just Evelyn. That alone made my throat tighten. I set the envelope aside for a moment and looked through the rest. There were documents, legal ones, contracts and technical reports, maps with plotted lines stretching out into the sea. And tucked into a folder labeled Land Use Records was something that stopped me cold. A full ownership deed for the entire beachfront parcel, including rights to the underwater shelf directly below. Not just the land the house sat on, but everything underneath it. And all of it was in my name. The next folder held information on a private partnership Robert had initiated just a year before he passed. It involved oceanic data collection, seismic sensors, and something called coastal thermal energy capture. I didn't understand all the science, but I could see the valuation. The figures were staggering. Low estimates placed it at over $6 million once developed. And it was mine. Not in theory, not in spirit. Legally. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. Robert's letter was dated 2 months before his heart attack. He wrote plainly, like he always did. He said he had kept these documents hidden because he knew others would try to interfere. He didn't trust Tessa with the information. He worried about her sense of entitlement and the way she had grown distant from anything that didn't serve her. He ended the letter with a line I'll never forget. "You built this life with me, every inch of it, and this Evelyn is yours because you stayed when no one else did." I folded the letter and held it against my chest. For a long time I didn't move. The box sat open beside me, quiet and patient, like it had waited long enough. That evening I took the documents and placed them in a fireproof folder. I hid them in a safer place. Not because I planned to use them immediately, but because I needed time to think, to breathe, to remember that even when people rewrite the story, the truth still lives somewhere. And now I had it in my hands. What Tessa didn't know was that the house she dismissed, the one she treated like some forgotten relic, held more value than anything she had been trying to sell. Not just in money, in meaning. And for the first time since the will reading, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control. I called Jolene the next morning. Her voice was steady as always, but I could hear the shift when I told her what I had found. She said she'd meet me in person. She didn't trust phones anymore, not with what Tessa had been doing behind the scenes. We met at a small diner near the bay, one of those places where the coffee is weak, but the booths are soft, and the waitstaff know when to leave you be. Jolene came in with a file folder tucked under her arm. Her expression told me everything. This wasn't going to be easy. She opened the folder and laid out the papers. Loan applications, bank authorizations, and a limited power of attorney form. My name was signed at the bottom of one of them, but it wasn't my signature, not even close. Tessa had forged it. Clean, bold, confident handwriting that mimicked mine just enough to pass if no one was paying attention. Jolene said she had seen the same form when she reviewed the filings with a bank Tessa was working with. A 1.2 million business loan had been pushed through under my name, backed by the beachfront property. I felt the blood drain from my face. Jolene leaned in and lowered her voice. She said Tessa had partnered with a hospitality group trying to build boutique inns along the coastline. Fast expansion. High risk. Most of it was funded on promises and projections. The group needed collateral, and Tessa gave them the land. Our land. My land. I clenched my hands on the table. Not in rage, in disbelief. All this time, while I was grieving, while I was pulling myself out of silence, she was signing my name, risking everything Robert had set aside, everything I had been entrusted to protect. Jolene handed me a separate sheet, a breakdown of the loan terms. If the project defaulted, I would be responsible. They could seize the land, sell it, erase any trace of what had once been ours. I took a breath and looked out the window. The bay shimmered in the morning sun, calm and indifferent. I thought about that box under the floor, about the letter in Robert's handwriting, about the maps and contracts I had only begun to understand. I looked back at Jolene and said the words out loud for the first time. She is trying to steal it from me. Jolene nodded once. Then she told me we still had time. The forged signature could be challenged. The documents could be frozen. But I had to act fast. And I had to be willing to dig. So we started. That night back at the house, I pulled out the box again. This time I read every page. I made notes. I traced the property boundaries. I checked the dates. Every word, every number mattered now. What Tessa didn't realize was that her rush for control had made her careless. She left a trail, and I had just begun to follow it. By the end of that week, I had contacted Robert's old law firm. I didn't tell Tessa. I didn't warn her. I didn't make noise. I just moved. Because when someone tries to erase you quietly, you don't fight them with shouting. You fight them by becoming undeniable. I sat across from Harry McBride in his office, the walls lined with books that smelled of tobacco and old paper. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, with a slight tremor in his hand as he poured coffee. But when he spoke, his voice still had that edge of sharpness, the kind that made you sit straighter. I handed him the documents I had found in the floor. He didn't react immediately. He read. Page by page, his brows pulled together slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of his chair. When he finished, he leaned back and crossed his arms. He said Robert had come to him privately a few months before his passing. There had been tension with Tessa, concerns about the future of the property. Robert wanted to update his estate plan to reflect a more guarded transfer of assets. He created a secondary will, one that listed me as sole beneficiary of the beach property and its development rights. But he hadn't finalized it through the courts. It had been held waiting for my review and signature. I never received that version. Harry said he believed Robert had left it for me in that box. His plan was to talk to me in person after the holidays, but he passed before that conversation could happen. I sat still, letting the weight of it settle. Harry began scanning the timeline of Tessa's actions. The forged signature, the unauthorized loan, the misuse of property collateral. His tone turned cold. He said what Tessa did was more than unethical. It bordered on criminal fraud. And with the hidden documents I now held, I had leverage, not just to block her deal, but to reverse it. He asked if I wanted to go public, if I wanted to sue. I shook my head. That wasn't my way. I told him I wanted to protect what was mine. Yes, but more than that, I wanted it locked so tight no one could take it again. Harry smiled then, just a small, tired smile. He said, "Let's begin." Over the next few days, we worked quietly. We reactivated Robert's secondary will. Harry filed the documents to restore the legal status of the property under my sole ownership. He sent notices to the banks involved in Tessa's deal. Freezes were placed. Inquiries were launched. By the end of the week, the transaction was effectively stalled. Tessa had no idea. She thought she was moving toward a closing. She thought the money would clear. But behind the scenes, it was crumbling. And I said nothing. Back at the beach house, I stood at the edge of the porch, watching the fog roll in from the water. The wind carried a chill, but it felt different now, bracing, like air before a storm. Robert had trusted me to carry this, to guard it, to know when enough was enough. And now I was doing just that. I wasn't angry anymore, just clear. Clear about what had happened, clear about who I was to this family, and who I was not. The law was moving, quietly, cleanly, and when it reached her doorstep, there would be no yelling, no confrontation, only consequences. It was 2 days after the bank froze the transaction when I heard tires crunching on the gravel outside. I looked out the front window and saw her car. Same sleek black SUV she had bought after Robert's funeral, parked at an angle like she didn't plan to stay long. She didn't knock, just opened the front gate and walked up like she still owned part of it. I stayed seated at the kitchen table, hands around my cup of tea, waiting for her to cross the threshold. She stepped in and looked around, eyes scanning the room like it had changed somehow. It hadn't. Still the same worn wood floors, same seashell wind chime on the back screen door, still the same smell of salt and lemon polish. She didn't comment on any of it. She just said flat, like she was reading from a script, that she had a buyer lined up if I was ready to sell. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stood slowly, set my tea down, and met her eyes for the first time in weeks. I asked her how she managed to forget I was still alive. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. I walked past her, opened the back door, and let the breeze fill the room. The sound of waves rolling in, the same sound that had lulled us to sleep for years, the same sound Robert had loved in the early mornings, sitting out back with his coffee and sketch pad. I turned back to her and said it clearly. "You said I wasn't your mother. You told me to take this house and get out of your life." I reminded her that I had done exactly that. She stared at me unblinking, maybe waiting for me to take it back, maybe hoping for some kind of plea. But none came. She started talking fast, then said she didn't mean all of it, that things had gotten out of hand, that she was under pressure. She said she could still help me find a buyer, get a good deal before the market cooled. I let her finish. Then I asked her what she thought she was helping me with, because from where I stood I didn't need help. She looked confused then, just for a second. Her mask slipped and I saw it. Not guilt, not regret. Panic. A flicker of fear that she had miscalculated. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply said this place wasn't for sale. She stood frozen for a moment. Then she adjusted the strap of her purse and nodded like she had expected that all along. She walked to the door without another word, her heels tapping against the old wood, her shadow stretching long across the hallway. Just before stepping outside, she turned and looked at me. For a second, I thought I saw something real pass across her face. Not love, not warmth, but maybe a trace of memory, a flicker of that child I had raised. The girl who used to curl up beside me on stormy nights and ask to hear the same bedtime story over and over again. But it passed. She left. Quietly. I didn't follow her, didn't watch her drive off. Instead, I closed the door, turned the lock, and stood in the quiet hum of the house. The tide was coming in. I could feel it in the boards beneath my feet. There was nothing else to say. Some things break too clean to ever piece back together. ChatGPT, Danoi. The next morning, I stood at the kitchen counter with the sunlight pouring across the sink. The same counter where Robert used to fix his morning toast. The same view of the waves crashing against the rocks just beyond the pine trees. I knew it was time. I pulled out the manila folder I had tucked behind the cereal boxes. Inside were the final documents Harry and I had drafted. I had reviewed them until I knew every word. This was no longer about what had been taken. It was about what I chose to give on my own terms. I drove into town and parked near the courthouse. The air was crisp, the kind that bites through your sweater but wakes you up in the best way. I walked into the building with steady steps. There was no rush in me, only resolve. In the clerk's office, I filed the deed transfer. The entire property, including the land, the development rights, and the coastal permits, would now be held in trust under the Mercer Foundation, a non-profit established in my name, with a clear mission to fund education, job training, and digital literacy programs for women over 50, especially those displaced or starting over. The trust ensured I would retain full residence for the remainder of my life. No one could sell it. No one could touch it. Not a bank, not a company, not a child with poor intentions. It would remain mine until I was gone. After that, it would serve the women no one saw coming, the ones dismissed, overlooked, or told they had outlived their usefulness. I walked out of the office with the receipt tucked in my purse. Not triumphant, just calm. Back at the beach house, I sat on the back steps. The sky had softened to pale blue, and a few gulls floated overhead, quiet for once. The breeze smelled of seaweed and wood smoke. I closed my eyes and breathed in the salt, the air thick with early spring. The phone rang that afternoon. It was Harry. He said the Mercer Foundation's registration had gone through. The estimate on the land and the tech assets now placed the value just over 6.5 million. He asked if I wanted to issue a press release. I said no. This wasn't about announcements. It wasn't about letting Tessa know. She would find out in her own time, in her own way. Maybe when she tried to resubmit the loan and hit a wall. Maybe when she called the county and found the property no longer listed under my name alone. Or maybe someone would tell her. A friend. A rival. Someone she underestimated. But I didn't need to see it happen. I wasn't looking for vindication. I was looking for peace. I stayed up late that night. Not out of worry, just awake. I made myself a cup of warm milk like my mother used to do for me when I was a girl. I sat in the living room with the lamp on low, the waves keeping rhythm outside. The house didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like something settled. A memory made solid. A story that didn't need correcting, just completion. I thought of all the women I had met over the years. The ones who cleaned houses, raised grandchildren, ran corner shops, managed food banks. Women who had nothing in their name but gave everything they had. This house would be for them. I looked at the fire flickering in the hearth and thought of Robert, his quiet voice, his strong hands, the way he trusted me even when he never said it out loud. And in that silence, I finally felt him near. It was Jolene who told me first. She came by the house one afternoon with a paper bag of groceries, and that look on her face like she had news she didn't know how to deliver. I was in the middle of shelling peas at the kitchen table. She sat down, helped herself to a handful, and told me that Tessa's deal had fallen through. The bank had fully withdrawn the loan offer after discovering the forged signatures. The investors had backed out. The hospitality group was pulling their resources from the coastline project entirely. Tessa had overextended herself. Too many promises, not enough backing. She lost the condo in Portland, sold her car. Her name was quietly being removed from a few community boards she once bragged about leading, and she hadn't tried to call, not even once. Later that week, a letter arrived. No return address, no handwriting on the envelope, just my name. Inside was a photo, an old one, faded slightly at the edges. Tessa, at maybe 8 years old, in a ruffled blue dress, sitting cross-legged on the porch, smiling up at me as I brushed her hair. I was bent low behind her, one hand, mid-stroke, the other holding her shoulder still. It was a moment I barely remembered. But there it was, captured in full. No note, no explanation. I stared at the photo for a long time, not because I expected an apology in writing, but because I knew this was her way of saying something she still didn't have the language for. Regret doesn't always come dressed in full sentences. Sometimes it's quiet, wordless. A shared history passed back like a question no one knows how to answer. I tucked the photo into the drawer next to the stove, not because I wanted to forget it, but because I wasn't ready to display it either. I didn't cry then. I didn't even feel angry. What came over me instead was a kind of tiredness, the kind that settles in after you've been holding your breath for far too long. I made a pot of soup that night, the kind Robert used to request on cold evenings, chicken and wild rice with bay leaves and a splash of lemon. I let it simmer on the stove while the house went quiet. When I sat down to eat, I lit a candle, not for anything ceremonial, just to mark the stillness. I thought about the years, the choices, the cost of keeping a family together when it wants to split at the seams. I thought about what it takes to love someone who doesn't love you back in the way you hoped, and what it costs to finally stop asking them to. That night, as the wind pushed in from the sea, I opened a book but didn't read. I just sat there with it in my lap, letting the silence settle around me like a soft blanket. No calls, no footsteps, just the sound of the world being itself. Sometimes peace doesn't feel like joy. It feels like nothing. And maybe that's the beginning of healing. The morning of the foundation launch. For sunrise. The house was still and the tide was low. I stood at the window with a cup of coffee, watching the light shift slowly from grey to pale gold over the shoreline. It felt like the beginning of something, but not loud or grand, just steady. The event was small by design. No press, no stage lights, just folding chairs set up on the grass near the bluff behind the house. A simple banner read, "The Mercer Foundation," stitched onto canvas by a local woman whose husband had helped me with carpentry during the early renovations. A few volunteers wore matching blue cardigans, their sleeves pushed up as they arranged name tags and folding pamphlets. I wore a navy jacket over a cream blouse. Jolene had pressed my collar that morning. She said I looked like I had something to say. I told her I did, but not much. I was tired of speeches. When it came time to speak, I stepped to the front. There were maybe 40 people there. A few women from town. Some of the first recipients of the program. A group from the nearby vocational center. I recognized more faces than I expected. Women I had stood behind in grocery store lines. Women I had once shared benches with at town meetings. I didn't bring notes. I just told the truth. That the house behind me had once been a place of love, then for a time a place of grief, and now it would become a place of purpose. I said that no one tells older women what to do with their second chances, so we start writing that for ourselves. And then I stepped back. That was it. They clapped not wildly, just warmly, as if they understood that this moment wasn't about performance, it was about reclaiming space, about naming what had been unnamed for too long. After the ceremony, we walked the property. I showed the first scholarship recipients the study room we had cleared out upstairs. The big table Robert once used for his charts now held a row of laptops. One woman, maybe 60, with silver braids and denim overalls, placed her palm on the table like it was sacred. She said she hadn't touched a computer since 1989. We all smiled. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned amber, the guests began to leave. Some stayed to help fold chairs. Jolene poured cider into paper cups. We toasted without clinking. By twilight it was just the wind again, just the waves. Just me on the porch steps with my shoes off ankles warm from the last light of day. I thought about how much had changed without noise. No courtroom battles, no slammed doors, just a quiet redirection, a choice made firm. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like myself again. Not someone's second choice, not someone's placeholder, just a woman standing on her own land with a story finally told the way she chose to tell it. Each evening settled a little softer than the one before. I got used to the way the light moved through the house, the way the wind would press against the windows just before nightfall. The routine felt earned. I still received letters, handwritten envelopes with unfamiliar names. Most were from women I had never met. They shared pieces of their stories. Some had left marriages after decades. Some were raising grandchildren alone. Some were just trying to find steady ground after life knocked everything loose. Each letter reminded me that silence can carry more weight than shouting, and that when one woman chooses to stop hiding it, makes room for others to step forward too. I didn't hear from Tessa again, not directly, but Jolene told me she had taken a job at a smaller firm, something stable, something humble. There was a rumor she moved into a one-bedroom on the east side. No ocean view, no marble countertops, but steady work. And from what I gathered, she was keeping her head down. Sometimes I imagined her walking to the mailbox in the morning. I wondered if she ever looked out past the trees and remembered the sound of the sea, or the way the house smelled after rain. But those thoughts passed quickly. I no longer waited on reconciliation. I no longer filled the quiet with what-ifs. Instead, I filled my mornings with salt air and warm tea. I filled my afternoons with the sound of typing upstairs as the Foundation's volunteers trained in digital skills or wrote resumes. I filled my evenings with long walks along the bluff, each step grounding me in who I had become. The house didn't feel like a battleground anymore. It felt like something holy, not because of what was lost here, but because of what was built from the loss. Robert's old photo stayed on the mantel, not as a monument to the past, but as a reminder that the people who truly see us often leave gifts behind we don't understand until much later. I sat on the porch one last time before autumn rolled in. The wind picked up, brushing through the trees. I closed my eyes and let the sound carry through me. I had chosen peace, and peace had stayed. If you've ever been pushed out of a life you helped build, you're not alone. Sometimes silence speaks louder than confrontation, and sometimes the best justice is living well on your own terms. If this story reminded you of someone, or even a part of yourself, take a moment to breathe. You're not forgotten. You're not too late. You're still standing. And that matters more than you think.